Aaron Berkowitz with the Jewish Literary Journal, here with Elinor Lipman, who is the award-winning author of 16 books of fiction and nonfiction, including The Inn at Lake Divine, Isabel's Bed, I Can't Complain, all two personal essays on Turpentine Lane, and Rachel to the Rescue. She was the 2011 and 2012 Elizabeth Drew Professor of Creative Writing at Smith College, and divides her time between Manhattan and the Hudson Valley. Her newest book, Miss Demeanor, comes out in just a few days. Welcome, Elinor.
Thank you.
So with the new book coming out, what was the impetus for this novel?
You know, I have to say the impetus for almost all novels is it's time to write a new novel. And, it's my job. And I think it's a little bit like I was very, very close friends with Anita Shreve, the novelist, and she always expressed, well, what would I call it? She was always surprised when people would say to her, "What? You're starting another novel?" And she said, when an architect finishes one house and starts designing another one, do people express surprise? So I would say the impetus was time to write the next novel. And in terms of the story, it isn't the big picture for me. I start with just, sometimes it's an opening line, and then I just go forward. It's just, driving in the fog with, if I'm lucky, the headlights on.
Nice. Yeah, it's interesting. I think I can't remember who, but she sits down to write from 8 to 5 every day, and that's her day job. It's interesting. We often romanticize, it's art, so it should be some sort of muse appearing. But as you say, in other professions, nobody would argue that I need the muse to go practice medicine today. It's just you go to the hospital and you work.
Yeah. And I do, 8 to 5, that is, I couldn't do that. I have not a word limit, but a word minimum that I try to do 500 words a day. And then if that comes too early in the day, or if that comes too easily, then I push myself. And then when I get, 750, let me silence that, shut that off entirely. When I get to 760, I think, well, I'm not that far from 800, and then I go to 1,000. Yes, so not like that. Whoever did that 8 to 5, that is quite that.
Yeah, it seems a little bit too much to me as well. Trying to remember, all the names are escaping me today, but it'll come to me. He used to say that once you know where the story's going, that's the time to stop. That once you do sort of hit a rhythm, in some ways your brain is stopping to work, and that there's an unconscious thing happening where you're sort of filling in details of other stories into your own mix. Do you find that when you hit a certain point?
Do I hear that? No. I don't. I mean, with the first part of what you said about stopping, it was Ernest Hemingway who liked to stop when he had a really good, he just knew what the next line would be, or just had a very good line. Probably he knew where the story was going. So what was the second part of that person?
No, just if you find that at some point you feel your brain, maybe you go to 760 and your brain's sort of picking up from other places instead of your story, your voice.
Oh, it's things like, what am I making for dinner? And, is the wash out of the dryer yet? And so I haven't done this recently, but there was a time where I tied myself to the chair because, and it wasn't with a rope, it was with, a very nice scarf. But I felt that it was just a little reminder to stay there, tush in the chair, and don't get up to get a cookbook off the shelf or answer an email or anything like that. So it does, and I have a place that I go to, a sort of separate it's like an office that I feel is like there's a desk and not too many distractions. Of course, there's a coffee machine.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about the fog, the metaphor you used about the fog. I thought when I was reading the book that it had a very clear sort of almost start. There was a situation. Obviously, there's a situation of the misdemeanor that's being perpetrated. And I thought that was an interesting way to approach a book, something that I've never really thought about, like picking one incident to sort of allow your brain to go maybe into the fog. But it seemed like that was a story that sort of came to you perhaps before the book happened. Is that not true?
I generally have to rewrite the opening chapter, and sometimes it's many chapters, and sometimes it was one time like 126 pages that I threw out because it wasn't going anywhere. And the fog metaphor, I didn't mean that I'm in that kind of fog. I just meant in terms of the vision, in terms of the clarity, in terms of do I know where I'm going in the story. And so with this one, I had this whole other entry into the book, and it was kind of a bad idea, and I thought maybe, and this is not what the book is about, but maybe this person would be the kind of lower level good cook who tests recipes for other people. So I thought, well, maybe there's something in that, and some kind of inferiority complex that I could research. And I didn't do that. It was something close to that. I thought it had to do with cooking. The chapter that it begins with was actually the second or the third chapter in the first draft. When I brought that forward, and no secret, she is seen having sexual relations on the roof terrace of her building, even though it's midnight. A nosy woman across the street sees it and calls 911. So when I got to the end of that, I just thought, house arrest, that'll be an interesting thing to pursue. Since I consulted so many lawyers, it is actually, house arrest is sort of the pet name. It's really home confinement that she's been sentenced to.
Yeah. It's interesting that there is this element of confinement here as sort of limitation that comes along with the idea of relationship that seemed to be at play here as well. Sort of, right, the inciting instance that she's having sex with somebody in sort of a free manner, but then that love is developing within sort of a more contained box, let's call it. So it was just an interesting sort of play on that.
I like that. I'm going to use that.
Please feel free.
Yeah, because it was, it was spontaneous, and you're right. It was not contained at all. It was a rash decision, or no decision at all, hormonal. And then you're right. Then it became, very, very cautious, one step at a time, if that.
Yeah.
Good. I like that.
Please use it as much as you like. It was interesting to me as well that you opened with, it was time to write a new novel. Do you see yourself as a fiction writer who writes other things? Do you sort of see yourself more broadly, or how would you define sort of what your focus is?
Oh, definitely a novelist who does other things and writes. I write generally, it's about maybe 3 or 4 essays a year, and often it's because I'm asked to do it for a particular newspaper, usually a newspaper, and where else? Occasionally a website. I'm careful with that. For a while back, it was when my essay collection came out, which came out the same moment as The View from Penthouse Suite. 2 books were brought out at once by the same publisher. And Parade Magazine asked if I would do this column because of my title, I Can't Complain. It would be, things I complain about. So I did it for maybe 6 issues. I think it was, it wasn't what, I think it was just once a month, but that seemed to take up too much time. And then I read this piece from the New York Times op-ed, and it was called Slaves of the Internet Unite. And it was about don't do anything, don't write for free. So I don't write essays anymore if it's on the internet just to get something out there. So, about 3 or 4 a year, maybe
Yeah.
more.
Do you think genre plays within your novels, or do you think you sort of fit into a genre? Would you call your, looking over sort of all the work, there does seem to be sort of a thread of love story, perhaps rom-com if we're using a trite thing. Do you think of yourself in those terms?
Well, I think, a wonderful editor of mine named Jane Rosenman, this was many books ago, and she used to describe my books, a couple of books, that were sort of in her portfolio. Another one was Stephen Macaulay, a wonderful writer, and she used to say it was romantic comedy for intelligent adults. So I like that.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, right? Most stories are about probably elemental things, and I would assume love falls into that sort of elemental category.
Yeah, and I once there's a wonderful writer. It's now been, it has to be close to 20 years since she died, Carol Shields. She won the Pulitzer Prize for the Stone Diaries. And I met her after I reviewed a fabulous book of hers called The Republic of Love for the New York Times. It's the only time I ever wrote back to the editor and asked if I could have more words. I've never done that before. I hadn't done that before or since. I eventually met Carol, and we talked. We both wrote, had love in our stories. And, we both said there's a lot of hypocrisy in this world. I mean, if you went to talk to your shrink and said, I just feel that something's missing from my life and I don't have someone to love. The shrink isn't going to say, oh, that's so light and slight, that's not what we're here for. Yet, in fiction, it can be seen as not serious enough. And we say, the late Carol Shields and I, what's more serious than that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at the end of the day, the fundamentals of reading a lot of the times have to do with relationships, and obviously love is one version. Something else that comes up a lot in your writing is politics. So I'm interested in sort of your balance between art for art's sake and art for political sake, if you see a distinction or if you don't.
Oh, let's see. Again, art for art's sake, art for this is what I do. I'm so happy that people still want to publish the books that I write, and I have contracts. The politics, the book before this, Rachel to the Rescue. I just couldn't help myself, and I just had this idea before I started that one. I just had to do something that involved, like somebody who worked at the Trump White House and was now looking back at that, had lost their job or had left. So I had a few bad ideas. One was going to be, like Melania's nutritionist, and one was going to be a tutor for the unmentionable Barron, because you're not supposed to, mention the children. And then one day I was reading Politico, and it talked about the office, it's the White House Office of Records Management, where their sole job was taping back together everything Trump ripped up because he couldn't help himself. So I said, bingo. That will be my character's job that she gets fired from in the first chapter. And, I couldn't help myself. And and nobody told me not to write it, not my agent and not my editor when we had lunch about it before it was done. And then when I finished it, I never had a book turned down. And when it was finished, then my agent kept hearing that the editors and publishers were worried that by the time the book came out, everyone would be suffering from Trump fatigue and they didn't want to do it. So I, on my own, sent it to my British publisher, and they took it in like right away and published it in about 2 weeks. So it was, well, no, 2 weeks. They published it on, yes, they published it. It turned out to be on my October birthday. And then, the ebook came out 1st, and 2 weeks later, on American Election Day, November 3rd, it was published. And then because of that, and because of nice responses, and people in this country were buying the British one, then my publisher, Houghton Mifflin, then they've since been bought by HarperCollins, and I'm a happy HarperCollins author. So then it came out. But that was like this little detour I took. And, not everybody has the same politics as, even if they're fans.
Sure.
So,
I mean, it's interesting when you use the word fatigue, and that's something that I've often come up against, especially within sort of, people are over in the publishing world, the Holocaust, or they're over anti-Semitism. But it's interesting because you're another book you wrote, The Inn at Lake Divine, does have that theme running through it. So it's an interesting sort of concept, that who's predicting the trends and what fatigue even means within an industry.
yeah, that The Inn at Lake Divine came out in 1998, and it was based on a letter my family actually got in the early 60s that said my mother had written to some hotels and sort of cottage colonies in Vermont, and waited to hear if they had openings. And the 2 weeks in July, my father always took vacation, and one wrote back and said that the people who come here year after year and feel most comfortable are Gentiles. So I never forgot that. And I wish I still had the letter, but I remembered where the hotel it came from, and I remembered what it looked like. And so I had this idea that I'd go to that hotel and write a nonfiction article about returning to this hotel that now had to be open, and being the returning Jewish author who was turned away when she was 10 years old. And and I'd be writing about what I was sure would be like the goyish food that they served at this place. And I called the local chamber of commerce to find out the number, and they told me it had burned down. It was like, oh no. And then within a day, I just said, well, I got to get back there anyway. And didn't know again if I could write that book about a restricted hotel narrated by a little Jewish girl, well, 16, but it's told from the perspective of her adulthood. And, it turned out to be, a pretty popular book.
It's interesting that the character, the love stories are around intermarriage. Do you see that as like the balance of aversion / wanting to belong, or attraction, almost seems present there, of like something that's different and that you're kept out of, so that might lead to I don't want to say hate, but at least sort of feeling anger towards, and yet there's something about that also attracts.
I don't know why I have done that. And I wrote a whole essay in my essay collection, which I think is called I Touch a Nerve. And I would go to maybe it would be a synagogue, book group, or someone's house. And often the Jewish audience would be mad at me would ask me, don't you feel you have a responsibility for Jews to marry Jews? And I would say, well, I really don't feel like I have that personal responsibility. And also, if I can tell the story about one person and meeting another person, and that's the story about, I'm not trying to represent whole religions and cultures. So I don't know, that's happened before. On Turpentine Lane, it's a Jewish family, and there's another wedding, because it's a Lipman book, so it's like Shakespeare comedies.
I was going to say, in good company.
Good company. But anyway, so I can't really explain that. It might be just growing up in, I grew up in I grew up in Lowell, Massachusetts, and it was a pretty Catholic city. And, it's probably just that. My late husband was Jewish, and my current lovely significant other is Jewish. In fact, he grew up in an Orthodox home in Liverpool where everybody was, or if you were Jewish, were Orthodox because they didn't have reform, or, they weren't, sort of layered. And so I don't know, I just, maybe it's a little bit of making, if there's a mixed marriage in the book, it's not a Jewish book. I don't know. Am I doing that? I don't know.
I mean, it seems to me like, again, back to what we were talking about before about confinement versus non-confinement, right? There is an openness that comes along with inviting another culture in, or how that works in some ways is more interesting perhaps than a singular culture. I also think that your point is valid, that oftentimes people want to read onto a book, like, oh, you're the main character, especially with like poetry or things of that nature, but even fiction, you're representing the Jewish people, or your stories affect more than a story should affect, in a way that, you're writing a book. So the book is telling a story. And if the character decides that, what does that have to do with sort of your ethic, your own personal ethic, or thoughts on, intermarriage? You're telling
Yeah.
a story about somebody else who's choosing it. So,
And in Turpentine Lane, then I think the family was named Franklin, and it was a family with no religion, and the other characters were co-workers, no religion. But I got to about halfway in the book, and I wanted to use this Yiddish expression, which in English is that one that says, that expression that is, you can't dance at two weddings with one tuchus. Are you familiar with that?
mhm.
Yes, you are. So I got halfway, and I so wanted the mother to say that to the daughter about the mother's separated and soon to be divorced husband. And I thought, well, there's only one way I can make her use. She can't say, my Jewish neighbor told me this wonderful expression. So I made them Jewish, and I changed their name to Frankel.
Yeah,
It was easy like that.
yeah, it works. It works nicely. Another thing that comes up a lot is food. Meaning, there's a lot of
Oh, yeah.
sort of people cooking.
Oh,
Are
yeah.
you a cook, or is that?
I am. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a lot. I once did an essay for Gourmet Magazine about, and answering the question I'm often asked, what's with the food in your book? So I cook a lot. And I went during COVID. I still do. I bake all our bread, and I even bake crackers. Uh, Yes, but I also found very early on that what people eat can also help characterize them. Like the guy who only wants franks and beans is different from the guy who wants, quinoa and ramps.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously the metaphor of ingredients, the ingredients of a character. Um, I once had a mentor who said that your job is to sort of notice the small differences in people. How somebody holds a door, how somebody would eat this food or that food are actually the key details as to who they are, versus like overarching personality, or using some sort of psychological method to understand a person. That in fact, the everyday things that they do specifically to them, that's what develops a person.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think I'm very good at, and don't want to describe too much. I'm sort of with, Elmore Leonard wrote this wonderful piece in the New York Times once. It was that series they had, writers on writing, and it was rules, and one of the rules was never start with the weather. And I once judged a contest that was short story collections, and I must have read about 50 of these collections. And I would say I found that about 50% of the stories in any given collection began with a description. It could be the sky, it could be the weather, it could be just, the flora and the fauna. And I often ask people, why do you think that's so common? And even great writers do that. I mean, I've it just happens to be a personal prejudice of mine. And as another item Elmore Leonard said in that same piece was, he tries to leave out the parts that people skip.
Yeah, that always seemed to me like Dickensian almost, that Dickens would describe literal weather for hundreds and hundreds of words. And I think it's perhaps a holdover from a different time. I don't know, but I agree that oftentimes, right, it's the actions that we care about. It's the interactions that the sort of, I've always struggled with defining place within my own work of trying to capture something that's not character almost. So yeah, it is a personal prejudice of mine as well, but I don't know if but it might be too much of a prejudice for me personally.
Yeah, I remember the same editor I mentioned before, Jane Rosenman. She once told me that she'd read a book and she really, really liked it very much. I don't know whether she was considering buying the manuscript, but she gave it to her son, who at the time was just maybe 12, and then asked him what he thought of it. And he said, he shook his head and he said, too much wind in the trees.
That's a nice phrase.
Yeah, too
Right.
much wind in the trees. And I so limit the description. It's just enough to help people see the place or see the character. But I usually have to be encouraged to do that. Don't forget, where are they? And but people fill in on their own. And I found that sometimes one physical characteristic carries the reader, and they paint the rest.
Yeah, that was actually the exact advice I was given when I was in my MFA, that pick one, facial feature or one specific thing about a person. That's what you describe, and everybody fills in the rest
Yeah.
of the, whatever it happens to be about that person. Something about a very strong but singular image allows the brain to use it as a tentpole and then go.
Yeah. I had in my novel, The Pursuit of Alice Thrift. Then there was a man. He was a nurse, and she was a doctor, and he was in like pediatric intensive neonatal unit. And all I said about him, I might have said that he was tall, but I had said that his skin was acne scarred, and I also said that he had a little toy koala bear clinging to a stethoscope in that way of pediatrics. And that's all I said about him. And the reviews would describe him, because of course he ended up the love interest, as handsome. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And then it might be that readers, this happened sort of the same thing with Good Riddance, where a younger man across the hall who wore braces was always described as, handsome and good looking. And I thought, I wonder if some reviewers see nice, which would be nice, if they saw nice and good, and they saw goodness as good looks. Well, that's fine. I can live with that.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that unconsciously we absorb that those who are good looking are nice. So it might work in reverse too, right? If we figure that a character is nice, I don't know if the transitive property or whichever property it is works backwards and forwards, but there might be an interesting psychological experimentation to be done there.
Yeah. Reviewers, at least, and I'm always surprised at that very thing, because I do, I don't want, my, first of all, I don't want a male character to walk into the book and be carrying a sign that says love interest, so I try to make it, a little unlikely, little unexpected. So I'm not going to make him, a movie star in any literal or physical way. So
yeah, that makes sense. I suppose then you sort of drift into that what we were talking about before, the rom-com as maybe less highbrow, where it's it's two very good looking people, or they're they're not really issues.
Sure, for sure. Yes, I like that too. Yeah, issues.
Yeah, without issues, then there I suppose it's less. Yeah, it would require less work on the reader's part to get it and allow for that to transition.
And I think with my various love stories, then it's it's circumstantial. Maybe they work together, they glance off each other, rather than there's this across a crowded room. That it's just, I would never write something where it was just someone is at, it's, I'm describing someone in a room at a bar at a party, and suddenly, they're thunderstruck by this good looking guy. I would just wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Cheap.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that. I definitely hear that. Well, as we wrap up, where can people find the book? Or it's coming out soon, right? Like very soon.
So the pub date is December 27th, and it'll be in stores then. And yeah, easy to find. And this is the first time a book of mine is being brought out first in paperback. It's a little bit sort of post-COVID, and it's really, it's a wonderful, I think it's a very good thing. It already went back to, but this is bragging a little, it went back to press before it came out, and I'm thinking that people, maybe pre-orders, that it's a good price point, as someone in marketing told me today.
Leave it to the marketers to romanticize.
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here tonight. I
Oh,
really appreciate your time,
I really enjoyed
conversation.
this. It's so nice to meet you.
My pleasure.